Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. I thought I would mix this one in here since it's been a couple of months since I last touched this series. And in this case, I wanted to talk about someone who was actually a lawyer turned mafioso and at the same time had a pretty unique nickname. In fact, when I was reading some of the information, it was the nickname that initially caught my attention, and I definitely wanted to share it here. But it goes to show that you can never tell a book by its cover when it comes to the world of the mafia. In a minute, you'll hear some descriptions of this guy essentially being referred to as a hobo, no less, when it came to how he looked and how he acted. But at the same time, he was someone that was, again, intelligent enough to become a lawyer and then use his smarts to eventually run the actual business itself, the actual crime family, but at least for a little bit. But you're looking at a picture of him now. His full name was Carman Joseph Milano, but the nickname that caught my attention was Flipper. So it was Carman Flipper Milano. More on that here in a minute. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all this fascinating information of this mafioso gangster. So who was this Carman Flipper Milano? Well, he was someone that was pretty much from the beginning, even indirectly, part of a crime family. And that's because this family was so heavily involved with it. And he pretty much ran and was still someone in the mafioso family all the way pretty much until he died. So he was born in Cleveland, Ohio, back on July 27th, 1929. His whole family was a big family, like in other words, somebody that was involved with the crime family. So he had three brothers, one by the name of John, one by the name of Frank, and another by the name of Peter. And then he also had a father who was a guy by the name of Anthony Milano. And then, of course, he had a mother, too. He also had an uncle, another guy by the name of Frank Milano. And then he had some other people that he was associated with as well. But each and every single one of them, outside of, I think, the mom itself, were involved with the family. So the crime family, at least. In fact, his father, Anthony Milano, was the underboss of the Cleveland crime family, at least from the 1930s to the 1970s. His uncle, the one I just mentioned, Frank Milano, ended up being the boss of a Cleveland family, but he was also someone who was part of the commission, the infamous commission, back in the 1930s. And then his brother, Peter, was also part of a crime family. In fact, he was the boss at one point of the Los Angeles crime family, and this would help Carman Flipper Milano become part of it too. But this guy, at least at the very beginning, even though his family was so heavily involved in this type of scenario, at the very beginning, he was someone that was almost playing it straight. In fact, he was someone that went to high school, graduated from high school, then later attended a university, the Loyola Marymount University, and then after that ended up going to the Loyola Law School. And it was during this time period that he was even part of a fraternity, the Phi Delta Phi fraternity. But yeah, he was there in law school. He met someone that he eventually married, that became his wife, and then he was admitted to the State Bar of California in 1955. So how about that? He was actually able to graduate from law school and then pass all the tests. I've heard about those tests too, that they're very, very strict, that it's hard to pass those tests. So those of you that are lawyers now, or at least have taken those tests, let me know if that's true, like how hard those are. I mentioned that because the intelligence that this guy had, it would have been someone that would have had at least enough wherewithal to eventually pass those type of rigorous tests and then become a lawyer. In fact, once that happened, he moved back to Cleveland to pursue any kind of career as an attorney. But the way I was reading the information, it was almost like it was few and far between when it came to those jobs. He was someone that was kind of loosely doing still work on the law side, in other words, as a lawyer, but then also mixing in work with other mobsters, businessmen, and then politicians too. In fact, part of it involved being holding parties at a place called the Italian American Brotherhood Club there in Little Italy, Cleveland. And that's where he would mix in a lot of those things there. Some of those parties apparently became pretty infamous. But yeah, he was also doing work for some of the Teamsters there, some of the labor unions as well. But as it turns out, eventually he was canceled or disbarred from practicing law because he was found guilty of working with some kind of fraudulent workers' compensation claims. I don't have the full details on that at least, but it goes to show that he was someone who had it at one point. Like he had a successful or going to be successful law career, at least as a lawyer, but somewhere along the way, I guess that temptation of mixing in things that he shouldn't be doing, that's when it started to creep into his life, and then that's when eventually it caught up to him, and then he was disbarred. I think someone backed me up on this too. In order to be disbarred, it takes a lot, right? Like it takes something involving a serious offense to be able to do so. So again, those of you that are lawyers, let me know how hard that is when it comes to being disbarred, because if so, then it goes to show like what type of severity this guy was doing. But that changed things for him when it came to his quote-unquote career. That's when in 1984, and this was shortly after he was disbarred, he moved back to California, and then that's when his older brother Peter, he was now running that Los Angeles crime family, and so he decided to join in. And then once that happened, he was part of a residence there, and that's when Peter helped him out too, again by being the boss of the family. He made Flipper as made man, and then that's when he in turn later on became the underboss. I don't know where, by the way, the name Flipper came from. I tried to see where that was, but for whatever reason, Flipper was his nickname because it was actually, yes, tied to the very dolphin of the infamous show too. Maybe it was his jovial manner. Maybe it was the way that he looked, like when he smiled, the way Flipper smiled. Yeah, how dolphins smile, in other words. Or maybe it was some noise that he would make laughing and sounded like Flipper, in other words. I have no idea on that part, but the name stuck. And that, in fact, he would actually tell people whenever he would meet them to call him Flipper. And so that's essentially what he became. He became known as Carman Flipper Milano. But yes, he was there, now part of the family, now as an underboss. His main role was just to make sure that he was the go-between between anything involving activities with the family and his brother. So that way there was no link, no direct link between him and those activities and the brother itself. So that way it would almost kind of shield that type of activity from law enforcement. And it seemed to work, at least for a little bit, because Carman was able to do this work, not just there in Cleveland, but also back on the East Coast. He started working with some of the other New York bosses there. In fact, there was another mobster who eventually turned into a government witness, a guy by the name of Anthony Fiato. And then here's what he described when it came to Flipper. He said, "I thought he was an effing hobo. His shirt's open, he has a big pot belly, scuffed shoes. He tells me to call him Flipper like the dolphin. My first impression of this guy was that he was a down-at-the-heels hobo, more so than some high-level mafia member. He was more of an albatross than a dolphin, but he was tougher than he looked. He had a reputation and wasn't afraid to mix it up." So again, this goes to show here that Flipper was not only using his name, but apparently his own appearance to be able to almost deceive people, to give them a different impression than what he really was, than someone that may have been more steely-eyed, minded, like when it came to how he acted behind the scenes, as opposed to, at least in front of people, what kind of impression he gave. In fact, there was more along the lines of him. Law enforcement was mentioning that he was running at one point a $1 million a week bookmaking operation there in Los Angeles. Can you imagine that? That's huge. $1984 too. So imagine $1 million on a weekly basis. That's the type of success that he was doing. And part of that success, of course, involved him making sure that people were making their bets, people were paying their bets as well. And then that involved a steely resolve to make sure that nobody could take advantage of him. But then there he was, just presenting just a more jovial, almost like a potbelly, scuffed shoes, hobo look, and telling people to call him Flipper to at least kind of throw people off when it came to what he could really do. But eventually, once again, law enforcement caught up to him. It turns out in 1987, the entire family there was caught. Like they were considered guilty of a RICO act. This was part of a 2-year investigation. He pled guilty, but he ended up getting just a very small amount. In fact, the most he could plead guilty to or was found guilty to was trying to extort money out of loan shark victims. And so because of this, he received a 6-month prison sentence and then 3 years probation. And he never had to actually admit guilt that he was part of a mafioso family. So how about that? Pretty light sentence, though, when it comes to all of his activities. And then for a very, at least brief period, for at least maybe a couple of years, he ended up running the LA family as well because his brother ended up going to jail. And so he was able to take over and then make sure that things were at least going smoothly before while his brother was going to be released a couple of years later. But then in the early 90s, things took another different turn when Flipper ended up moving to Las Vegas. That's right, he was there in Sin City, and he was there working with the family's interests within the city itself. But once again, just going back to his lifelong almost activity, doing nefarious things, no sooner was he there than he was already doing other fraudulent items, including a fraudulent diamond scheme, and then also working with food stamp fraud. So how about that too? It was just a short time period of being there that he was already doing all of these illegal activities. And then in 2000, he was found guilty by another court, this time by a judge there, who sentenced him to a harsher term, 21 months in prison because of his activities. And this is interesting too. At that point, he was actually considering becoming a government witness, breaking his omerta. In other words, I don't know how serious he took this or how others within the family realized, that he was going to do something like this, or when he decided to change his mind. But eventually he did so. He stopped from becoming a government witness, and there were no single acts of revenge against him for even considering it. You know how you hear that kind of stuff in other stories, how even if someone is suspected of being a government witness, that's where they get basically whacked and they just get killed outright. But no, his brother Peter ended up saving him. And then that's when he was released from prison, there was no harm done to Flipper. But then that was pretty much it. There didn't seem to be much info for him afterward. Once he was released back in 2002, then that's when he apparently just lived more of a quiet life. It may have been this too. He was suffering from what was considered renal failure, and this was something involving end-stage kidney disease issues, and then he ended up dying of cardiac arrest. This was in January 3rd, 2006. So maybe when he was released, maybe he was in his final legs of his years, he realized that and he decided to live a quiet life, or maybe it just happened all at once, who knows. But that was essentially the end of Carman Flipper Milano, lawyer turned mafioso, guy whose family was essentially part of the crime family for the longest time. Decided to go straight, at least for a little bit, but even then, all the way up to him practicing being a lawyer, then that's when he was involved in some nefarious activities and then became a full member of the mafia, and then eventually not just underboss, but boss itself, and then moving over to Las Vegas towards the final parts of his quote-unquote career. Interesting stuff, right? In fact, one last thing I wanted to mention here, there was an FBI agent by the name of Bob Hammer who kind of said it best when he was talking about Flipper. He said, if you were making a movie, you could almost cast George Costanza as the underboss. George Costanza was in that great TV show Seinfeld. He says, I'm not trying to minimize the impact of the family, but he was the gentleman underboss. He was probably one of the last guys you'd pick out of a lineup and identify as the underboss. And then he said he was extremely personable, and I believe Carman was somewhat ahead of the time. He grew up in a society where the mob kids became mob guys, but he became a lawyer even though he was disbarred. That pretty much sums up best when it comes to Flipper. But if anybody has any more info, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. What about those of you there in the Cleveland, Ohio area? If you know more information on a local level about Flipper, love to hear what your comments are too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.